All right. So we're talking about the 15-minute city, very buzzy term. We're going to try to break it down. We're going to try to say some maybe provocative things to get people excited for the day, third day, day 3. So yeah, I think the 15-minute city is, in my opinion, I guess, it's a bit of an overused term these days. So again, I think today we're going to really try to unpack like what does that actually mean from a policy, from a kind of implementation perspective. And what I'm really excited about today is, representing the Urban Freight Lab now and thinking about freight all the time. I feel like we have a good representative panel to sort of, again, break some of the stereotypes I feel like that perpetuate around this concept, around sort of just like, we'll make everything a walkable, pedestrianize everything, take away all the parking, and freight is still an integral part of our networks, and so we do have to kind of think about how we're moving the goods as well as the people into this kind of concept. So I am excited to have some folks that specialize in kind of curb and freight, and some expert regional planner and director level folks to really kind of bring that perspective to light in the panel today. So we're going freight forward, 15-minute city today is the jam. So I'll let you guys introduce yourself. I guess we'll just kind of go in order, but won't do lengthy intros, but just to kind of set the stage of how we're gonna like wear our hats today in the conversation. So I'll let Zach go first.
Hey, I'm Zach Rash. I'm the co-founder and CEO of Coco. We make these robots you see here, and we move food and groceries faster and at a much lower cost than existing car-based methods.
Good morning, everybody. I'm Jordan Justice, co-founder and CEO of Automotus. We are a curb management company that helps cities better understand what's happening on the ground and then automate operations like payment and enforcement with cameras to help them manage growing commercial vehicle traffic.
All right, good morning. I'm Eulois Cleckley, Director and CEO of the Miami-Dade Department of Transportation and Public Works. Actually, I have a pretty extensive freight background. In my previous positions, I actually worked for the Washington, D.C. Department of Transportation, actually ran their freight programs there. And I actually started off my transportation career doing supply chain management because my background is in transportation economics. So I am very excited to be here because it's a rarity to actually have this topic come up in this context. So I'm excited about the conversation today.
Good morning. I'm Darren Chitsey. I'm the Chief Operating Officer of the Southern California Association of Governments. For those of you not from Southern California, welcome. We are the metropolitan planning organization representing 191 cities and 6 counties throughout Southern California. We do the long-range transportation, environmental, housing plans, and our job is really to look 25 plus years into the future and to think, what are the challenges going to be, and how can we start to implement real-time policies with our members today to hope to overcome those challenges in the long run. So looking forward to the panel. Excited to be here.
Right on. Okay. Our illustrious panel. So we're going to do some questions, and then I feel like I haven't seen as much Q&A at the conference, so I'm hoping we have, so get your juices flowing for some good, again, provocative questions here for later. So we'll start with Darren. I have a question for you. Again, Darren's got the long view. He's looking at kind of the long-range plans. He's been doing this a long time. My understanding, like 20 years at SCAG?
Pretty close.
Amazing. So, this isn't a new concept, right, the 15-minute city, but it builds on a lot of best practices that a lot of us have worked on for a long time, aligning growth, access to transit, access to mobility choices. So how is SCAG defining the 15-minute communities, and what have you been doing to date to kind of promote this concept and think about it again in that longer range context?
Yeah, great question. When you think about the 15-minute city, and I should add that we really think about it as 15-minute communities. Because in a region like ours that, as I mentioned, 191 cities, it's very polycentric. And on top of just those cities, we really have developed in a way that are just a lot of different communities. And for those of you that aren't from Southern California, you might not understand this, but yes, we're in a downtown right now, but when you look out across the region, there are so many different little neighborhoods and little communities. So we really focus on that 15-minute community rather than thinking about it as a city as a whole. But the concept itself is not new. When we look back to, and it was mentioned, I've worked at SCAG a long time. I did not work there in 1978, but I still love to go back and look at our old regional transportation plans because it really tells you so much. And so these concepts, obviously about increasing opportunities for walking, for biking, more community-centric, looking at VMT, have certainly been there for a very long time. But this concept, certainly, of 15-minute communities is a new way to really think and communicate it that I think is important because when you talk about TOD, when you talk about other types of words that planners tend to use and we use all the time, it doesn't make a lot of sense for people in neighborhoods. But when you start to put a concept around it, say, okay, we can create a community that you can access everything that you need in a short amount of time, it starts to make sense. And I think that's where you start to get some of the community buy-in from it. So when we look at what defines a 15-minute community, we don't have a hard definition, but it's something as we're looking at our next long-range regional transportation plan, we really want to focus on because it helps us kind of certainly shoot for that. But the concept is having services that you need to access every day in a more attainable manner. And we think that certainly builds on the equity of the community and just the access for all. So thinking about how do people get to school easier, how do people get services that they don't necessarily need to get in their car but can really either walk or bike. And it really builds upon, thinking holistically about what makes a community. And I think we have to think certainly not just is housing near jobs, are there services near jobs, but how do you build that safety around it? So certainly we'll talk a little bit about maybe later, hopefully, but what is our safety program? How are we looking to ensure that our streets are safe so that people feel comfortable walking and biking in neighborhoods that have traditionally been very car dominated?
Great. Yeah, so kind of setting the stage of like how SCAG's thinking about the 15-minute community, and want to move to Miami and Eulois and sort of a recent study I found by Googling. I believe it had a funny name. It was like a Move Buddha, so caveat, footnote. But it said that Miami was #1 for potential for the 15-minute city. So I thought that was interesting, considering you were on our panel. And that the Miami Herald was on the record saying Miami's a city of interconnected villages. So I kind of wanted, do you feel that rings true? Do you think Move Buddha got it right? And tell us more about how Miami's kind of thinking about this and approaching it.
I think the Move Buddha article was written by Triple C.
Carlos.
Yeah, you could take credit for that. So, but I think both of those perceptions and concepts, I do feel that they're true in terms of the desire that the county has to create access. And really, the 15-minute city, from my perspective, that's really what it's about. As we've mentioned before, it's not a new concept. Cities traditionally, they've been built since the beginning of time. It's been built with the nexus and the connectivity to an existing transportation system. So Miami's no different, where Miami was basically built and founded based off of the railroad. And so if you go back to the 1800s, people lived in proximity to where the amenities at the time existed. So it's not a new concept. What transpired over the past 100 years is the poor planning and the poor design decisions that have created separation in communities. And this is a circumstance that you have now. So for all of us in the industry, what we're trying to do is not repeat those ills of the past and then retrofit our existing system to something that should have been planned for and designed for from the very get-go. So in Miami, and just to give some context for Miami-Dade County and the Department of Transportation and Public Works, we're the overarching provider for transit services within the county. We have 34 municipalities, and each one of those municipalities or cities have different mobility needs, and they're unique in their own circumstance, and we try to help support them to provide alternative ways for them to get around, as opposed to just, of course, traveling around by themselves in their vehicle. But our goal is to increase access, whether it be the expansion of our Metro Rail system or our Metro Mover system, which is an automated people mover system, or improving our existing bus network, which comprises of about 70% of our overall ridership. So all of these efforts are really in an effort to make sure that we are providing the proper access and we can get people to where they need to go quicker, and so they can have a better quality of life. And so we have this big, huge capital program called the SMART program, which if you heard our vice chairman, Oliver Gilbert, yesterday, he mentioned some of this a little bit. He's very interested in our efforts around urban air mobility, but he has been a leader with respect to making sure that we're moving forward with the implementation of our SMART program, which is the expansion of 6 mass transit corridors within the county. And if we were able to accomplish this, hopefully in the next decade, we will have 2/3 of the population and 3/4 of the jobs within 2 miles of a transit corridor. And that is significant. And we are in the best position probably ever to actually deliver this important capital program. It's a $10 billion program, and it's been in and on the books for the past 20 years to help deliver, and we're excited to figure out ways that we can expand our transit system in that regard. But also, we're making improvements to our bus network, where we're creating a better optimized bus system where we provide additional access to people that need it the most, reduce wait times, and really focus on actually increased frequency, which for us in Miami-Dade County is having routes that are 15-minute frequency. So again, those are just 2 examples from a transportation standpoint, from a transit side of what we're doing to help our communities out. And then the last thing I'll just mention is that we are working with our municipal partners to implement a on-demand service called Go Connect. It's actually powered by VIA. We currently have it now. This is actually a program that Triple C runs. And we have 4 zones currently within the county. We are looking to expand that service out to many other zones to better connect up with our Metro Rail stops, so we can again have that level of connectivity and accessibility that people want. So I would like to believe that those 2 articles are true.
Thank you, Move Buddha. You can look it up online. That's great, Eulois. Yeah. So now we're going to kind of step out a little bit, go a little macro here with our private sector folks here. So Zach and Jordan, y'all both have companies that are operating in kind of business districts. You're interacting with the infrastructure, the sidewalk, the curb. You're also interacting with the establishments, both the kind of users of that, the end user, as well as like the business owners that are sort of happening in these business districts and interacting with your products. So wanted to kind of we'll start with Jordan, but what are you seeing as some of these more macro trends that are maybe bringing this 15-minute community concept kind of, to the Move Buddha? I'm really plugging Move Buddha here today. No idea who writes this thing. But why is this a topic that's showing up when I Google a lot right now? And what are you seeing as those sort of macroeconomic or other prevailing winds trends in the market?
Yeah, it's a good question. I would say you should look for some more Move Buddha articles and maybe dive a little bit deeper here. But overall, what we do is work with cities to better understand how the public right-of-way is being used today. And what we've seen the last couple of years is just dramatic changes, specifically in how the curb has been used, no longer for long-term parking, but now in cities like LA, Santa Monica, Pittsburgh, and urban areas, we're seeing more than 1/3 of all parking is now double parking, people blocking bike lanes, traffic lanes, turning lanes, which obviously impacts our ability to implement 15-minute cities if you can't use a bike lane to get groceries or go to work, or if your bus or your transit lane is blocked by a UPS truck, it can certainly impact how we're able to attain some of these goals. But beyond that, more than half of parking now is commercial vehicles. It's 8 minutes or less going in to pick up a DoorDash order, drop off a package. And so a lot of the challenges that we're seeing have really proliferated as a result, partially due to COVID and our consumer behaviors changing. But overall, what we're seeing now is that's persisting. And I think a lot of the challenges and opportunities we see is how we can right-size both people and goods movement from a volume of vehicle perspective, whether that's things like COCO or how we can incentivize or better incentivize transit and disincentivize single occupancy vehicles. But overall, we're seeing that a lot of cities are now looking at things like the curb and other mechanisms to incentivize alternative freight approaches to really help reduce congestion and a lot of challenges that are not letting LA reach the Move Buddha or other cities reach the Move Buddha targets here. But that's a high level from what we've seen anyways.
Yeah, thanks, Jordan. And Zach, you want to build on that? Like, what are those macro trends that Coco's seeing in your interactions?
Yeah, food delivery is already really local. Most people order from the neighborhoods where they live because food's pretty perishable, so you want to eat it pretty quickly. It doesn't transport across all of Los Angeles very well. And we're seeing it get even more and more local as you get this kind of emergence of ghost kitchens. So these would be these big facilities that can cook 20, 40 brands in one facility. And that gives brands the opportunity to put their food closer to where their customers live. And on top of that, you have virtual brands, which is where maybe a big fast food brand will license their food and license their brand to local restaurants to, again, move their food closer to customers. So most of food delivery is happening within a mile or two of where people live. And that continues to accelerate. So it doesn't make a ton of sense to add a lot more cars and traffic into these neighborhoods just to move this food around, 5, 10, 15 blocks. So that's where Coco really thrives, is we can do this in a much cleaner, more sustainable way, in a much more efficient way, where we can reduce the cost for these local businesses. And it actually results in a faster and better delivery experience because we're not dealing with the congestion getting around these neighborhoods at 7 p.m. when everyone wants to order food delivery. So we have some partners that have, we'll have these ghost kitchens that have 40 brands in them. And at 7 p.m., it's on Santa Monica Boulevard. I mean, it gets completely packed and congested. And it can take, 20, 25 minutes just for the driver, the DoorDash or Uber Eats driver, to pick up that food to bring it to the customer. So we give them these smaller footprint vehicles that are built for food. The food goes straight into these vehicles, then it goes off to the customers. There's a faster delivery experience. The food's arriving hotter and better condition. And we're doing almost all of the deliveries for these brands. So further deliveries we'll use couriers to fulfill, but we're doing a huge majority of it with this sort of footprint vehicle.
Great, yeah, and I feel like some other stuff we hit on in some of our previous macro trends. Obviously, COVID, post-COVID, we're seeing real changes in obviously commuter patterns, but also the way people are shopping, and also sort of a renewed focus and interest on supply chain. Is a hot topic in sort of my space especially, but also the business owners, right? Like you both are interacting kind of at the curb or at the kind of point of entry with small businesses, restaurateurs, et cetera, which is a key part of this 15-minute community concept, right? The actual establishments, the services that people are trying to access. So, yeah, I think it's just something to keep in mind of all these reinforcements of all the different interconnected points, which now I'll go to Eulois to kind of build on that. Now we'll start talking about okay, what are we going to do about this? This is we've got kind of some of the background. So we know this is complicated, though, right? I mean, if we read the abstract for this, it was just what are the policies to solve this problem? It's but okay, let's break it down a little bit. Sort of tools in the toolkit, right? You're leading a DOT, right? So you're a piece of the broader puzzle, which Darren will build on, but. What do you feel like are these kind of tools in the toolkit for DOTs and leaders in the transportation space to be kind of putting the pieces together? And you hit on one already with transit, but I'm wondering, what else are you working on, and how do you see your role kind of in the transportation space as being the leader there?
Right. Yeah. Appreciate the question, and then just to add a little bit more color to this, because you talked about food delivery, right? But freight is all encompassing. So there's everything that you guys are wearing came to you or came to a shop where you bought it by some vehicle, a truck, for the most part, right? And so in the planning world, we kind of think flowerly and try to make sure that the air is clean and everything is fantastic and prettified and alike. But our lives are dominated by this thing called freight, and that gets delivered by sometimes dirty vehicles or not the sexiest and most attractive piece of equipment. So figuring out a way to balance that with having again, an attractive place to live is always the back and forth. Is always kind of the trade-offs, because you make a decision one way where it might impact supply chains or freight delivery, and it impacts every single last one of us because the cost of your good goes up. So the price of our products are dictated by the supply chain that governs how they're manufactured and delivered to you. And that's about 40 to 60% of the price of a product. So if you're in a city environment where you're trying to make all of these policy adjustments, you have to compensate for the fact of what are we doing to make sure we're not creating an environment where it's so costly for the products and that impacts each and every one of us in our lifestyle. So I just want to kind of throw that out as a controversial statement. And hopefully your robot can move some clothes too at some point. But one of the things in Miami-Dade where we're looking at is really how do we improve the nexus between our transportation infrastructure and our land use policy. And we most recently adopted a pretty significant policy around zoning with respect to the SMART program corridors that I mentioned before, so these 6 expanded corridors, where it's really to try to incentivize density and improved use of future development along those corridors. So one, we can build higher instead of building out wide, and then you can have more mixed-use development, which can help support that 15-minute city concept. And so that's one tool, and I think all of us are trying to make sure that we mash together the land use policies with our transportation projects moving forward. But also, as it relates to just the everyday policies and processes, this is something that back in my time in Washington, D.C., especially with respect to the freight aspect, curbside management and the way that you manage the demand for the curb, a lot of times it falls on the localities and municipalities and the cities. And in Washington, D.C., we actually did a pretty significant study and evaluation to try to understand what is the true demand for the curbside and how can we repurpose the curb to add additional space and loading zones for freight delivery so we can support our small businesses, which at the end of the day not only makes the business thrive, it creates a safer operating environment for everybody. And we would have fights back and forth between our bike planners and our freight planners and alike, and all the engineers that we had that were planning all of our roadways. But we figured out a way to make it work. And so I think the other tool in the toolbox is making sure everybody understands the importance of these different disciplines and understand the impact that they have in trying to create an ecosystem that you can move people and freight as effectively as possible. And so sometimes that is not natural, I think, in the industry. And so figuring out ways that you can train staff and develop a mindset that we're really trying to make sure that we are meeting that ultimate goal of moving people and products as best we can.
Love this sales pitch. This is great. Hashtag freight. 15-minute communities, hashtag freight. All right, Darren, I love these examples too of like what Miami, what Skag's doing. So basically, Darren, it's on you to answer the question in the abstract. What are the policies that are going to create 15-minute communities from a land use, financial services, and transport housing policy?
We're ready. I got 16 pages of talking points for my staff to answer the question. Okay. So you guys ready? No, but certainly the transportation piece is a big part of it, and the freight portion is a big part of it. But in a region like ours that has so many different municipalities, it's really about how do we provide the tools to those cities to think differently about their existing communities and how do they change them in the future. And I say that because we're so built out. Those of you that might have flown in from other places or looked around, there's not a lot of extra land, so to speak, in the broader Southern California area. And remember, this is one city that we're in right now, Los Angeles, that's 4 million people. That's obviously a very large city. But when we look out to the other 190 cities that we represent, about half of those are under 100,000 in population. So that means they don't have the same staff capacity and resources to think about planning as much as sometimes larger cities have. So SCAG's real focus has been, really over the last decade, and it's gotten a big amplification by some state resources to provide those tools to think about what are those policies and how do we implement those policies to bring some of these ideas forward. A couple examples specifically that we've been able to do, thanks in huge part to the state of California that realized this was an opportunity. We've had policies in the state to incentivize looking at and requiring us to obviously connect our transportation and land use policies very closely for a long time. But what was missing is a real injection of resources to say, okay, here are the policies, but here's some ideas and really specific examples about how each of your communities that are so diverse can think about it. And so we've been able to launch a couple new programs over the last couple years that we're really excited about. One is that is just launched in recent months is what we're called other to housing. So looking out over our communities, there's a lot of pieces of what we would call underutilized real estate. They might be corner strip centers. They might be gas stations that are going out of business. Sometimes they're golf courses. But if a city is really looking at how do we turn that into housing, which we really think is certainly the foundation of a 15-minute community, they don't always have the tools given their various resource levels. So it's kind of a suite of tools that we're offering to give them kind of a step-by-step path about how to bring more housing into their kind of central business areas that we think will really support that foundation. But another part of that is utilities. A lot of these communities were not built for the types of housing that we're expecting to see over the next decade plus, and without a real thoughtful plan around how do we bring in, better sewer infrastructure, better electricity, they're going to have a hard time really bringing in those investors that can't add that. They're never going to pencil them out when they have to do those huge infrastructure investments just to make that housing work. And then the third part of it, and I touched on a little bit earlier, that's really critical, is if the neighborhoods don't feel safe to walk and bike in, people aren't going to do it. People that have kids, I have to tell you a quick story though too. We were walking in Santa Monica and I saw a Coco robot go by. My kids were like, "That is the coolest thing I've ever seen." And I'm like, "Oh, I'm going to be on a panel with the guy that started that next week." They're like, "Why would you be on a panel with somebody that does that?" But it just shows that there's so many obviously new ideas and excitement, and the work that we do is hard to communicate. It's hard to get people excited, and so thinking about how do we get people excited about thinking about their community a different way, it has been a challenge. But the Go Human program that we launched, almost a decade ago now, has really been focused on how do you bring the human element to safety. And had outreach around encouraging people to drive slower around schools or drive slower around neighborhoods, because without that kind of conscious awareness of really encouraging safety activities, we aren't going to get people to want to bike and walk in these communities to the numbers that we are. We've also specifically invested in kind of infrastructure investments that really adjust, whether it be increased and protected bike lanes, whether it be looking at other ways to have traffic flow through communities. We think all of those policies really need to layer on each other and really make it easy for cities to bring forward not just the curbside changes that need to happen, but really a whole robust suite of policies, because so many of our cities are built. We're not starting master plan communities for the most part here in Southern California. So it's how do we do those incremental changes that have the biggest impact, and then on top of that, we've got to communicate that back to the broader population. If the community isn't excited for it, the city council is going to be nervous about making those changes, and so that's why these concepts around 15-minute community and being really able to communicate to a wider audience, what are they getting from it? How are they benefiting from it? How is it better for air quality? How is it better for health? How can they spend their time more efficiently when they're not sitting in the car all day, but can really experience the neighborhood that they are excited to live in a different way, is going to be, I think, the biggest part of how we get there.
Were you going to add something?
No, it's something that Darren was talking about. Really, it's incumbent on local government, whether it be on the regional level, local level, or even at the state level, to figure out the best ways to manage your existing assets as best you can. And so in Miami-Dade County, as an example, we have a program where we actually have the largest advanced traffic management system program in the world by value. We have basically a contract where we're going to be upgrading over 3,000 of our traffic controllers at our intersections, adding additional sensors and leveraging a camera system to be able to detect and end up analyzing the data from a predictive standpoint to try to figure out how we can have our traffic signals move vehicles to include freight vehicles in a much safer manner, as well as detect conflicts with pedestrians and bikes as well to get to that kind of safer environment. And so, there's opportunities where you can embed technology in your existing system to manage your assets better and create that safer environment. So I just wanted to bring that out.
Yeah, these are good organic segues back to our tech folks over here. So the next question was for Zach about sort of what are we missing? You're interacting with the environment, you're interacting with the asset, you're operating a new technology. I feel like the themes coming up, urban density, more housing. My layperson's like, oh, that seems to be good for business, like more people to deliver to, creating a 15-minute community. Again, you kind of laid out that's your optimal operating radius, right? So how do you see kind of your robot or tech like this fitting into this kind of 15-minute community concept?
Yeah, I mean, anything that's good for pedestrians is good for us. These operate much like adding a pedestrian to the road. So anything that's making the community more walkable is going to benefit us, and it's going to benefit the businesses we service. Right now, they're reliant on cars, and that's the way all the deliveries are done for the most part in most cities, and especially Los Angeles. So they need another viable alternative to deliver their food, which was basically just marketing or incremental sales a couple years ago. But coming out of the pandemic, I mean, it's a majority sometimes of their whole business. So anything that we can do to support non-car based transportation methods would be good for us. And we see this in different neighborhoods across Los Angeles and some other cities. There's a pretty big variance between different neighborhoods. Some neighborhoods are really walkable, and we can navigate those areas extremely well. And then other areas are not so much, and we have to do a lot of creative work, and we have to develop a lot of technology to be able to navigate that efficiently. And it's a pretty noticeable difference between different neighborhoods.
Do you and Jordan kind of see yourselves as a bridge to this community, or do you feel like, meaning, Darren was kind of talking about you have to bring relevance to sort of how is this going to impact people at the human level, and kind of building on that, like how do you see these emerging technologies, like again fitting into how we can like propel this concept forward? Do you see y'all as we're like key partners in lockstep, and like how can we do better together, or are y'all kind of going in on your own and feel like you have to prove that value through your technology on your own? I'm just kind of
I think it's a bit of both. I mean, you always have to prove the value to some extent in a standalone fashion. Like for us, we work with cities to deploy what we call smart loading zones to help reduce double parking, safety hazards, emissions, congestion caused by freight and food delivery primarily, but also TNCs and other short-term uses. But it's a small piece in a big puzzle, as these guys know, right? I mean, there's a lot of different moving pieces. In most cities that we work with, we're also trying to target adding smart loading zones next to mobility hubs where you can have scooters or curbside EV charging, as well as use these types of zones and new technologies to deploy innovative policies to advance these efforts as well, whether that be pricing or incentives or disincentives for EVs versus ICEs and lower emissions or lower impact modes. But overall, I mean, it takes a comprehensive approach, but you need things to work in and of themselves. But obviously, as you start to prove them out, they scale up and they become pretty cohesive. But it certainly takes a village, as you all know.
Yeah, I guess my personal thought is that I would love to see some of the technology partners, and I know it can be hard when you're a small startup, you don't have like the lobbying arm or your huge policy team, but coming, to the city council meetings to advocate for, your business, I would guess, benefits from like, leading pedestrian intervals and things like that, where it's like, maybe not business critical, but it's like improvements that improve, again, progress us towards this vision of the community, but also benefit your business. So I think there's opportunity for maybe us to be more strategic in the future, e-bike companies and people operating cargo bikes or whatever, advocating at the meeting for the bike lanes and like actually showing up. And I think there's, we'd like to see more of that. Hashtag CoMotion, hashtag freight. So yeah, what's missing? This was sort of like open popcorn, and then I do want to like, we've been talking a lot, but like there's smart people in the room that I won't call on you, but I see a few that I'm looking at. What are we missing? What haven't we talked about yet? I love Eulois's like freight monologue over here. That was great, and I'm gonna record this and grab it for the UFL. But yeah, there's so much to unpack here. I feel like Darren's.
I just think there's one opportunity we haven't talked about yet, and that's kind of this post-COVID world we're in. And when we, obviously, the world changed a lot over the last couple of years, and telecommuting has been a big part of that. And at a regional level, a lot of positives when we think about, we did a study, maybe it's 5, maybe it's 15% of, regional VMT could be reduced by increased of telecommuting. But what we don't talk about enough is what does that mean to the community? Because there's commuters that certainly might have come to a traditional downtown 5 days a week, and now they're in their own community, not just on Saturdays and Sundays, but maybe on Mondays and Fridays, maybe every day. And so I think this opportunity to build around our communities in a different way, when there's more opportunity for business activity throughout the entire week, is a really important opportunity that we need to focus on over the next couple of years as it starts to sort out what the kind of new normal looks like. And so I just didn't want to leave that off because, so much is changing in so many ways, but that opportunity to really reshape communities, there's some urgency around it. Because if these ideas that we're talking about don't start to change quickly, we're going to lose this kind of the momentum that we have to rethink what our neighborhoods look like in a very significant way.
I agree. All right, what are we missing? What haven't we? Who has the solution on our housing land use financial services policy to create 15-minute communities?
There's one component of this that's tied to the land use piece, and it's very apropos here in Miami, where this past year Miami now is the highest rental market in the country, which just kind of happened just like that because of what transpired with COVID. And I'm being careful with people from Florida and Miami, but I moved down there last year from Denver, and in Colorado COVID existed, but in Florida it didn't. But so as a byproduct of that, everybody decided to come down to South Florida, and all of a sudden within 2 years you had essentially a significant increase in rental prices as well as home prices. And so people in traditional neighborhoods were either being priced out, and affordability became an issue. And so most recently our county mayor, Daniela Levine Cava, essentially announced an affordability crisis and tried to figure out ways that we can incentivize more affordable housing to be built as a part of many of our projects. What's interestingly enough, our department, because we run a transit system, we build just as much affordable housing as our housing development agency, where each one of our 23 Metro Rail stations, we have built transit-oriented development, and we're not going to stop. So when we expand this system, there's going to be more TOD opportunities and the like, which at this point where we are looking at is trying to figure out ways to maximize affordability with respect to those future developments. And it is going to be a necessity that there is a nexus between not only the land use and what gets built, but the units that get built and whether or not they're going to be able to be occupied at people that need to provide services for a respective city or county or any other industries that make a city or county actually run. So it's a concern, and I think tackling that from a land use standpoint and making sure that your projects are very intentional about ensuring that the development communities can support affordable housing is going to be critical as we move forward, especially during this uncertain time. So I think there's benefits in doing all of that, and that's something that we're trying to look at here in Miami.
Anything else we're missing that we didn't cover, Zach or Jordan?
I mean, I kind of touched on it a little bit, but I think going on the COVID angle, that's also, it's moved, like I was saying, it moved a lot of the restaurants' demand and sales to delivery, which is a much less profitable channel historically for them. And this has really impacted businesses that are set up around catering lunches for big offices, right? So we've seen that that hasn't recovered very quickly. It's a lot more people working from home. So one of the big things we're trying to do is work with businesses at trying to fill in gaps in demand, like basically promote like a lunch menu, and then we can, because we make delivery so much more affordable, we can make it easier for people to order food when they're working at the day, whereas they usually get it catered to their office. But that kind of transition to so much more of their sales happening on delivery. They need cheaper alternatives, and the current pressure on pricing is going in the wrong direction. It's getting harder and harder for these businesses as they're reaching this massive scale and capacity. It's getting harder for them to, the price, the actual cost of doing delivery is actually going up, and so it's moving in a bad direction. So there needs to be other solutions there to support these local businesses.
Jordan, not to put you on any last words that you feel like we haven't covered yet. I'm giving you the opportunity.
I feel like we've covered a bit, but no, I mean, I think it's everybody's made some really good points here, and just emphasizing the adaptability that's necessary for cities to be resilient as things are changing, as we're seeing massive population growth as Miami becomes the 6th borough of New York, and we're seeing, a lot of these businesses need to adapt to changing consumer behavior. I mean, it's critical that our transportation infrastructure is really adaptable. Our policies, our pricing, our incentives, disincentives reflect the changing communities that we all live in, because it's a challenge for everybody, right? So.
Yeah.
That's all I have.
Oh, Eulois has more. All right.
I wanted to, not to put y'all on the spot. So I'm just curious, have you guys seen pushback based off of this new technology? And more specifically, for people that might perceive that this new technology is eliminating a delivery driver's job. Just curious, how many unions have reached out to you yet?
Yeah, we when we launched this, it was a total coincidence. We started this. My co-founder and I started ideating on this in the very beginning of 2020. So we coincidentally launched it in April or March. So our first customers was the retired elderly community in Santa Monica, who were getting discounted grocery delivery at a time where they didn't want to go to the store. So there's been a couple good kind of tailwinds for us in the pandemic of people being a little bit more accepting of why this is happening. I think the awareness on the commissions that some of these big delivery marketplaces charge restaurants has become a lot more public and a lot more front of mind for people when they're wondering, how do I support my local businesses, and it's become a little bit notorious that these channels aren't profitable for them. So I think there's a couple of these kind of macro tailwinds that are helping these be a little bit more accepted. But also we, like I was saying, I mean, these are moving at basically walking speed. They're basically adding another pedestrian to the sidewalks, and we don't use the main sidewalks where you have a ton of foot traffic because it would be slow anyways. So it'd be pretty easy to walk around Santa Monica with hundreds of these and not see them too often.
I'd be curious to ask, though, I mean, to your point, these may be, and PDDs may be displacing some 1099s, but obviously, AVs and your experience in freight are displacing Teamsters and those unions. What kind of pushback have you seen there?
So I can tell you that there's a concern just across the board, whether it be in the freight world or in the transit world, just the integration of new technologies and robotics and autonomy replacing the individual providing that current job. So it's a legit concern, and I think as the new technology starts to proliferate throughout not only the industry, but it gets more adopted, that is going to be something to try to figure out how to better ensure that the new technology is being accepted at the same time understood that it's not displacing an entire industry. And so I'm just throwing that out, that is something that we especially when we're looking at autonomous vehicles on the transit side, when we deal with our union, they want to see, okay, what is your plan? And they want to protect their workforce as best as possible. That's their job. So as you start to see more of this, and you start to see an increased strain on having just the people to be able to deliver, you're still going to get that type of pushback because people perceive it as a threat. So I don't believe it is. I think you have to have, again, the layering on of technology and the people aspect of this to have a cohesive approach to being able to provide, whether it be transit service or freight delivery, because without that, again, we'll be in a position where not only will it be more costly, but not as efficient as what it could be. But I'm telling you, it's a reality that at some point, once you guys grow, hopefully to get large enough, you're gonna have to face, because there'll be questions about accepting this as a typical mode to move products.
Yeah, and I should clarify, these are human driven. We think autonomy is still a ways away, and we want to work on creating a product that's useful today. And this gives us a lot of operating efficiencies by having our drivers work from home. So they can switch between deliveries, switch between cities, and you're not paying for all the downtime. And it's a much more profitable job for the people actually driving it, because as you know, doing food delivery is a pretty hard business to make work with depreciation on your car and gas and insurance and everything. So these are piloted, and we do try to be pretty vocal about that to the public, so they know that we're not just replacing all these jobs. And in fact, we do hire quite a bit in the local markets. We have local mechanics who will service and repair the robots. We have field operations team that can respond to anything and within 15 minutes in the city, and then of course hiring pilots. So we try to be pretty vocal about that, and I think that's important to kind of bridge this technology gap to make sure it's still very human-centric.
Yeah, I'll put a bow on that by just saying I feel like it's the people that come to this conference, it's kind of incumbent on us to act as those educators and be able to kind of speak in both worlds and communicate like where are the values and where are the threats and risks, and at the labor level, but at the not just tech for tech's sake, but tech that's actually adding value to cities and from a revenue side or from an efficiency side. And so, I think this conference is a good example of like how we can understand each other better, so we can act as those kind of like public educators. Darren, did you have one last thing, or should we?
I just wanted to ask these guys a question too. We're going to pass along the moderating duties. No, but certainly, CoMotion is all about bringing public sector and private sector innovators together to think differently, and there's no doubt that it's going to take public-private partnerships. Zach and Jeremy, what should we be thinking about on the public sector side? Not to pick companies by any way, but are there things that we should be doing on data, on information, explaining policies, that really can help bolster some of the innovation that's happening in this industry that needs to happen?
Yeah, I think there's a lot going on already. We work with SCAG, and we work with the Open Mobility Foundation, which Miami-Dade is a part of, and a lot of other cities that are a lot more forward-leading on pulling a lot of that data together to make better decisions. The hard part that we run into, and I'm sure Zach does too to some extent, is some policy in cities, whether that's a gray area where there's not policy, and you have city attorneys that may be a little bit slower to move than you all would like, and than we all would like, as well as just trying to get political bodies to implement policies that enable you all to do your jobs better, right? And so that's not something I would say is like a piece of advice for you guys. You guys know that better than anybody, but That's just a piece that we always run into in trying to get all of these great technologies, all of these great policies, plans, practices in place, is getting all of the other external or internal parties to help push from behind instead of stand in front of.
Yeah, and as you can imagine, there's a whole bunch of gray areas around how you would define this. And so working through that, and a lot of the laws and policies that exist are meant for cars and defining a vehicle as a car. So we've had to spend a good amount of time working through that to make sure that cities understand that, but also that the policy can be interpreted and redrafted if necessary to allow this sort of vehicle, so that we can get away from this addiction to cars, which in Los Angeles is like a pretty major issue.
We could go on. I love my my pseudo moderators over here. This is good. It's taking the pressure off. But I want to leave some time for questions. So I had one last question, but I'll tee it up, and then it's like audience. So it's basically saying, hey, we all live in neighborhoods or communities. We live somewhere, and so we're all kind of part of this solution, right? And what can we do, kind of as residents in communities, to propel this? Like, we don't need to answer that. That was just sort of like thought exercise of the day. Like, what is our role beyond our sort of work hat, but just as our like person hat, to kind of propel these forward? And then, yeah, I'd love questions. I feel like we could keep going here, but we could keep grilling these two, but we'll put it back to the audience. So what do we got? What do we got around here? Okay, do you need them? Oh, perfect, okay.
Hi, Brian Buggy with Vancouver. Legendary urban planning up there. And one of the key driver for the 15-minute neighborhoods in Vancouver actually is the climate emergency. So we passed the climate emergency plan in 2020. And there's 6 bold moves, and the number one bold move is to improve all neighborhoods for walking, biking, and rolling. And you asked the question earlier, well, what's missing? Well, I haven't heard anything about what the panelists are doing, with respect to addressing climate or the climate emergency. And obviously, lots of other co-benefits, but that's the main driver in Vancouver. Any thoughts?
Yeah,
Absolutely. I mean, that's the thought. Yeah, we didn't say it directly, but certainly that's been the driving force about a lot of the work that we've been doing over the last decade is, reducing VMT to reduce GHG. But I think talking about the co-benefits is really important. That's a number one priority to a lot of people for good reason and very passionate about it. But I do think communities also do react to what does it mean for me? How is the air cleaner so we can be outside on more criteria pollutants? How is it safer? How does it benefit my day? But you're absolutely right. We can't forget to lead on an important issue like that when we're talking about what are the benefits.
I would just add one thing too that we've seen. We're fortunate to work with both Santa Monica and Los Angeles to launch the 2 first zero emissions delivery zones projects here in the U.S. And a big piece of that is going back to the policy work that those cities have done, but really starting to think about how we can incentivize mode shift, not just from people in here that can afford to buy a Tesla, but trying to get your mom and pop shops, your regional delivery businesses to start to transition over from these incredibly high-emitting diesel vehicles over to your EVs, e-cargo bikes, things like that, really from a policy perspective as well as from a pricing perspective, whether it's creating free access to parts of the city or zones or discounted access. We've seen that as a big driver. And in Santa Monica, we've seen a little bit over 5 times adoption of EVs in zero-emission zones versus control locations as well, which is just an interesting tidbit, but I'm sure Eulois has.
I was going to add too, but Eulois, you go first.
Yeah, definitely. I think that's climate kind of undergirds a lot of transportation policies these days, especially when you're trying to electrify your fleet or any other improvements to your transportation system from a transit perspective. So I think it's understood. It's interesting being in South Florida where I think it ends up being a political discussion as opposed to a policy one. And I would say that in order for any of these policies really take hold, you do have to have the leadership at the variety of levels of government to be able to buy in, to be able to invest in a new way of thinking, as well as invest in new technology from a vehicle standpoint and the like. So it's something that, at least in South Florida, we're at a point where we do have the executive and the legislative branch, our Board of County Commissioners, and everybody on board that we have to reinvest different ways to be able to support the environment as we move forward. And that has tremendous benefits across the board from a business as well as a community perspective.
And I was just going to add shameless Urban Freight Lab research plug, but that research and sort of data-driven insights that empower our politicians and our leaders to say, hey, I actually have information on how this can provide value. So we just published a paper in Nature that showed if you provide real-time curb availability information, hashtag Automotus, you can reduce driver circling by 30%. And we've done previous research that shows that drivers spend about an hour a day, delivery drivers spend about an hour a day circling for parking. So that's like, you can do the math on that, that adds up. That is like a data-driven insight that can help drive the policy, drive the discussions, rather than sort of talking in. I think, Darren, the co-benefits and sort of, we get climate fatigue and exhaustion, and it's like, let's get those numbers so we can really kind of make our case. So again, research is important to kind of add to that conversation. That's Kelly.
And also, it goes without saying that this is not gas powered. So these are electric, but it's also important to note that this is also, not just is this like a really inexpensive EV, it's also really light. So on a pure energy basis, we're using a much more purpose-built vehicle, rather than it still wouldn't be great to have all that food being transported in a couple thousand-pound electric vehicle. Just because it still requires a lot more energy to transport a couple pounds. So this is 80 pounds, and it's much more purpose-built for food.
Great, thanks.